Hello and welcome back to the Hazzabhajan YouTube channel. It is Harry here, and today it is time for another brand new series on my channel, which is going to be, well, random league generator, I guess? In this series, I decided to investigate the various football leagues across the world, tying in with my football alphabet series a little bit of trying to bring the more obscure footballing nations and the more obscure footballing leagues into the spotlight and examine them and obviously just, as I say, bring them to light. However, I then decided to expand it to the national team as well, as opposed to just the league, as I thought it would be better to do an in-depth profile, or as in-depth a profile as physically possible, as opposed to just the league. I will also bring into the video how football revolved around the situation in the country at that time, be it economically or politically, which is the case with today's video. So if you're someone who doesn't like politics and football mixed together,
look away now.
Also, just for a quick disclaimer, each of the top 5 leagues, England, France, Germany, Spain and Italy, are disregarded for this series. Every other country's league is eligible to feature. With all this in mind, I used a random country generator online to give me a league to discuss. And although the first draw gave me Colombia, it then gave me an idea which I thought I would bring up in a different video related to that league, so stay tuned for that when it comes out. I redrew and got the favourite country from the TV show Pointless, which is the Central African Republic. Here goes nothing. The Central African Republic, which was named Ubangisheri originally, was one of many countries that found themselves under France's colonial rule in Africa throughout the early 20th century, forming a part of the region that they called French Equatorial Africa. Much like most of the countries France, and indeed the rest of the world, colonised, the indigenous people were exposed to brutal working conditions. The French leased land in the country to a plethora of European companies, who went on to exploit the workers and force them to collect ivory and rubber and work on plantations with little to no pay. As a result of this, disease and famine took hold, and the population decreased by nearly half under French colonial rule. A rebellion from 1928 to 1931 ultimately proved unsuccessful, and the people were moved to colonially designated villages for them to be watched over to prevent such uprisings from happening again. In 1957, however, Barthélemy Boganda, elected to the French National Assembly in 1946 as the representative of French Equatorial Africa, dreamt of the 4 regions making up this French Equatorial Africa territory, those being Gabon, Chad, Congo and what would later be the Central African Republic, to become one independent nation. The former 3 refused, but just before Boganda's death in 1959, a constitution was drafted for Ubangisheri to become independent and remove itself from France's colonial rule. France accepted, and a year on the 13th of August 1960, the Central African Republic was created. Merely a year after this, the National Football Association was established, although things didn't get off to the most promising of starts, as they suffered the heaviest defeat in their history that year, losing 11-0 to the Ivory Coast. Undeterred, they became affiliated with FIFA in 1964, who were ever willing to accept as many nations as possible in order to make sure that they could brand football as the world's game, and then eventually the Confédération Africaine de Foot in the late 1960s. Sadly, this was all set against a terrible political backdrop, as the president, David Dacko, had made Messin the only viable political party in the country for the 1964 election, which he of course won unopposed. All this led to was debt, economic decline and threats of bankruptcy and general strikes, leading to Dacko being replaced by Jean-Baptiste Baldassa, the Commander General of the army. Unfortunately, the Central African Republic had, inadvertently, found themselves yet another leader taken over by avarice and an insatiable desire for absolute power. He declared himself emperor in 1976, a ceremony which was funded by France, but despite a growth in the economy, he too would see the country spiral down eventually, and Dacko was reinstated as president in 1979. Within 2 years, however, he was gone again anyway, to be replaced by yet another authoritarian leader in André Kolimba, who dissolved military committees and barred free elections until 1993, after riots broke out against his leadership and the lack of free elections 2 years prior. With all this in mind, it is perhaps unsurprising to say that football in the Central African Republic hasn't really progressed all that much. Their first entry into World Cup qualification came in 1982, although they were disqualified before the process could start, as they didn't pay the entry fee required and were banned from taking part by FIFA. They would have to wait until 2002 for another crack at the whip, during which time the country had started its quest for democracy, yet suffered from 3 military coups, all of which proved to be unsuccessful, continued looting of the capital city of Bangui, and the end of French involvement in the country, after they closed their final military base located in the region. As you can tell, the country was in upheaval, and it wasn't stable enough politically or economically to maintain a consistent challenge for football's major tournaments. Sure enough, in that 2002 qualification campaign, they lost 4-1 on aggregate to Zimbabwe in the first round, and they withdrew from the next two tournaments, including in 2010, which was to be the first World Cup to be hosted in Africa. As a result of this, as well as some poor form in friendlies, they found themselves in 202nd position in the FIFA World Rankings by 2009, and again between March and September 2010. However, intriguingly enough, whilst in 202nd position, they actually enjoyed a renaissance, winning the CEMAC Cup in 2009, which is a tournament for countries in the Central African region, and almost reaching the 2012 African Cup of Nations, finishing second behind Morocco in their qualifying group. FIFA recognised their efforts, which also included their first ever World Cup qualification win, a 2-0 success against Botswana in March 2012, bringing them up to 49th in the World Rankings by October 2012, to date their highest position in the FIFA World Rankings. It was, however, around this time that the country descended into a civil war which it is yet to escape from, after Seleka rebels began an incursion which resulted in them taking over the government. And although the person who took over, Michel Diop-Dodia, disbanded Seleka despite being one of their focal members, they continue to pillage and inflict violence upon the nation and its citizens. Despite a temporary ceasefire in 2014 and elections in 2016, problems continue, especially after a Seleka faction announced an autonomous Republic of Legon region, which hasn't been internationally recognised, and the government seemed to be unable to quell the threats that they pose. Up to a quarter of the population had been displaced by early 2018, and over half were in desperate need of international aid. As you might have guessed, the country had been unable to capitalise on their halcyon days between 2009 and 2012, and they've slipped back in recent times, failing to get past the first round in 2018 World Cup qualifying. The player with the most caps for the national team is Foxy Keteboama with 42, and their top scorer, Hilaire Momi, only has 9, and 5 of them came in that triumph in the CEMAC Cup back in 2009. The only player who plays for the Central African Republic whom you may know of is Valencia's Jeffrey Kondogbia, who despite representing France at every youth level as well as the senior side, was not tied to France, as all of his games for the senior side were friendlies and therefore non-competitive games, meaning that if he so chose to, he could switch his allegiances to the Central African Republic. He did so in 2018, and he has won 4 caps since, scoring once. Although it is purported that there was a league in the country in 1948, with an official champion being given as AS Tempet Mokaf in 1958, the first league season post-independence took place in 1968, with US Catin becoming the first ever league champions. Although remarkably, that is their only league triumph to date. There are 5 seasons in the history of the league where the winners are completely unknown, including 3 of the 4 seasons after the first league season took place post-independence, those being 1969, 1970 and 1972. With the others being in 1987 and, somehow, 2007. In 1998, 2002 and 2020, the latter presumably as a result of a combination of the coronavirus pandemic and the civil war in the country, the league was actually cancelled completely and not finished. And perhaps owing to continuous uprisings and unrest throughout the country, the 2014-15 season was simply not held. The most successful sides in the league's history both have 12 titles apiece, those being Olympique Real de Bangui, previously known as Real Olympique Castel, and AS Tempad Mokaf, who won the last completed season in 2018-19. Stade Centrafricain and ASDA Fatima follow those 2 powerhouses of the Central African Republican game, winning 5 titles each to date. Interestingly, all of the title winners in the league's history hail from the capital city of Bangui, and almost all of the teams in the top flight play at the national stadium, named after Barthelemy Boganda, the man who originally proposed the Central African Republic's independence. As much as I would love to have started this series with a country that is flourishing in the footballing world, and not one which has been dishevelled by political uprisings and strife, alas, it is not to be the case. How long I will keep this going for is another question, as there are 205 countries affiliated with FIFA that don't include the top 5 leagues in the world, and if I did one a week, I'd be done in 2024, which is of course a long way away. But for now, the first league in this new series has been the Central African Republic, or rather the first country in this series has been the Central African Republic. If you've enjoyed this idea and enjoyed this series as a whole, I guess, and the video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, comment what you think of the whole situation. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you then.